I'm hoping I'm putting this in the appropriate area since I could really need some help on how to handle my current circumstance. I've been wed to Christy for a considerable amount of time. Together, we are parents to 2 kids. Robert. The eldest, Diana Robert, was our only kid for a while, until my wife unintentionally became pregnant with Diana again. Years subsequently. Since we both intended to have just 1 kid, we were thankful that God had granted us a second. I have always worked hard to provide for both of my children since I love them equally. We had only been married for 2 years when my wife and I welcomed Robert into the world, and I was ecstatic to have my little companion. I can still clearly recall his birthday. I was holding him in my arms for the first time, and my hands were shaking. When I realized he was my son, I sobbed with happiness. Due to health complications, Chrissy spent a lot of time in and out of hospitals in the first several months following her delivery. So whenever Chrissy was home, I would spend a lot of time taking care of Robert by myself. I would never give her any childcare responsibilities because I wanted her to get as much rest as possible. Fortunately, I ran my own business, which allowed me to conduct most of my meetings from home. This allowed me to focus entirely on raising my son while my wife was recovering. Now, because I spent so much of Robert's early years with him, he and I were always close. I witnessed his first steps and encouraged him to play basketball when he fell off his bike while learning to ride. We would practice or shoot baskets every Sunday afternoon. Every night we would watch movies together on the couch with him cuddled up next to me. He felt so much more connected to me than he did to Christy, I knew, because my wife occasionally grumbled about it. Not because my son was unkind to his mother, he just didn't spend a lot of time with her. She never really spent any time with our son one-on-one, therefore she was primarily to blame for this. She always seemed unsure of how to connect with him and would then ask me to go with them whenever I pushed her to take him out for ice cream or for a drive so they could talk. Robert never talked to me about it, but I'm sure he sensed the distance from his mother. Eventually, Christy unexpectedly became pregnant with Diana. The physicians reassured us that there would be no challenges this time around, but we were nonetheless apprehensive about her potential health problems similar to those from her first pregnancy. Chrissy had always expressed to me her desire for a little replica of herself, and I believe that after our daughter was born, she was granted her wish. Diana shares my wife's blue eyes and my blonde hair exactly. We had a lot easier time with our second child. We did not worry as much as we did when Robert was here, since we had learned from our past mistakes. Though I have both a boy and a daughter, I can honestly tell that before Diana was born, my heart had never felt so gentle. I know many say they don't care what gender their baby is. When you hold your daughter for the first time as a parent, you feel like everything is possible for her. I had the impression afterward that I could destroy the entire globe if necessary to keep my kid warm. I firmly believe that having a daughter may fundamentally alter a man. My son made me more relaxed. However, I felt possessive of my daughter and learnt to be cautious around her. My young child was not to be harmed by anyone. During our second pregnancy, Christy and I were a little concerned because we wanted Robert and Diana to get along. However, there was a notable 8.5-year age difference between them. Fortunately, everything turned up okay. Diana had Robert as an amazing older brother from the beginning. When she was awake, he would play with her or just watch her sleep, all while showing her love. From the beginning, my son showed a great deal of attention to his younger sister, and I'm happy to report that my kids have always been quite close. That's just what all parents desire. Nothing compares to having your sibling as your best buddy, to be honest. After discussing my kids, I'd like to go into further detail regarding my marriage. I met Christy during our time in college. Being the daughter of immigrants, I was a nerd with specific aspirations for my post-college career. I always wanted to launch my own business and make enough money to provide my parents with everything they could ever ask for, because I saw how hard my parents worked throughout their life. But Christy's life was so much simpler than mine was. She was from an upper-middle-class family, so she was, shall we say, financially secure. When I first met Christy, she and her friends were having a wild time at a party, and she was completely inebriated. Despite her beauty, I felt she was much beyond my abilities, so I didn't even try to start a discussion with her. But when we ran into each other again at a party, Christy came up to me and asked to dance. I didn't know any fancy moves being a nerdy child, so we mainly simply scampered around and laughed. Christy was an outgoing, intelligent, self-assured person who didn't hesitate to express herself in front of others. I wasn't sure about us despite all of the signs she was sending my way to ask her out. Not only was I a self-assured kid back then, but Christy was also a party animal. Those were the days when she felt surrounded by her pals and could party until the sun rose the next day. I knew it would be a waste of time for both of us to ask her out because I've always been the kind of man who doesn't go on dates for pleasure. But Christy never gives up and isn't someone who can be disregarded lightly. She eventually questioned me about why I didn't want to go out with her after we met at a party for the 4th or 5th time. She was very upset when I told her the truth. She advised me to stop wasting my time at the library and to relax and enjoy my time in college. I could feel something connecting with her. She made good arguments about accepting our desire to each other and living each day as it comes. When I did ask her out at last, the rest is history. To be perfectly honest, for the sake of the narrative, Christy and I have had problems because of her drinking addiction, but we have never ended our relationship. After a few drinks, my wife transforms into a different person when she is completely inebriated. After 5 or 6 drinks, she loses her sweetness and starts acting really rudely toward others around her. She was given the nickname Miss Jekyll and Hyde in college because it seemed as though she had 2 distinct personalities. I recall our first meeting at a pub, which is when I first noticed her other side. That year we were all turning 21, and we wanted to celebrate at this inexpensive bar that served 25% off beverages from 4 to 5 p.m. Everybody was enjoying themselves. After drinking too much, Christy went to the bathroom to urinate. She ran across a server who had unintentionally spilled beverages on her dress on her way back. We saw the entire thing happen, and I ran to my girlfriend's aid, but Christy began yelling and yanking her hair before I could get to her. Watching my fiancée publicly humiliate herself by yelling profanity at the poor server, who appeared shocked and repeated apologizing, left me in disbelief. The manager finally ordered us to leave because Chrissy would not stop making a big deal out of everything. Despite my best efforts to soothe her, her pals persisted in urging her to escalate the situation, despite her obvious wrongdoing. Her buddies started angrily threatening the manager when he tried to remove us, but she wouldn't go. It was terrifying when one of them broke the glass on the floor. I knew right away that the management would call the cops if this kept up. I paid my bill and Chris's separately to the manager, decided not to get into any trouble that night, and made ready to head away. I tried to talk Chrissy out of leaving with me, but she wouldn't go until the waiter paid for her dry cleaning because her dress had been wet from a drink spill. Luckily, I left in time because the gang was arrested and the police were summoned shortly after. To get help, they had to call their parents. It made sense that everyone was furious with me for avoiding the problem. I received texts from some even calling me unfaithful, and that they would no longer like to invite me to their events. To be honest, I didn't mind because I didn't want to be connected to someone who had legal issues. Chrissy, though, was not pleased with how things turned out. She insisted that we should help one another and stick together in these circumstances, and she wanted me to apologize to her friends. I made it clear that in contrast to her family, my parents would not put up with this kind of behavior. If I ever needed them to come get me out of jail, they would be pissed off. Chrissy's varied background made it difficult for her to comprehend this. She eventually had to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to help her pals get back together, and that I wouldn't be going with her if she wanted to hang out with them. Since then, precisely what has occurred is as described. Even though Chrissy asked me to go to some of her friends' parties, I never shown any interest in hanging out with them. Rather, I concentrated on preparing my career and achieving my goals. Chrissy and her pals were running into legal issues in the interim, but since their parents had excellent attorneys, nothing was recorded on their official records. Chrissy didn't gradually realize until after we graduated that the same group of friends who had formerly enjoyed spending the entire day together were now too preoccupied with their own lives and were drifting apart, wanting little to do with one another. Though I think this is a typical aspect of growing up, she had to accept this hard. She decided to move in with me when it was time for me to move because I had found work in a different place. Chrissy said that she would make the perfect roommate, but I never thought we would move in together right after graduation. She assured me that living with me would enable her to concentrate on getting a career and taking her future more seriously. But because she didn't make any late financial contributions, I had a difficult time paying our rent and expenses throughout the first 6 months of our relationship. I merely asked her to cook, but even that didn't seem like enough work for her. When I would encourage her to go to the gym or the park, she would remark about how depressed she was. She would also spend hours sitting on the couch watching Tech Talk. It wasn't until I had sat down and discussed my financial situation with her. At last, the Chrissy realized how big of a job I had. After submitting numerous applications, she eventually found a position in a digital marketing firm that seemed to fit her needs. Having a financial partner eased my worries about money, which was a relief. But Chrissy loved to spend her money, even though she didn't have much to begin with. Whenever she was bored and had a phone in her hand, she would buy makeup and perfumes. The amount of boxes that came at our door for her was so many that I lost count. I was concerned about this behavior because we were living together and probably getting married soon. I wanted a mate who was going to put money down for our future. She didn't appear to have any solid financial intentions when I was investing my money and preparing for a down payment on a property. I understood, though, that I couldn't force her to change. That was something she had to learn for herself. I said nothing, therefore. I recall once having saved enough money for my own car purchase on my birthday, regardless of how lavish her shopping got. For me, it was a big investment, and I was happy with my accomplishments. When Chrissy realized I had saved up enough money for a car, she was astonished and insisted on looking into my account. She was astounded by the amount of money I had saved. I think she realized she needed to improve her financial situation after witnessing me make such a large purchase. I was pleasantly delighted when she eventually started talking to me about investing her money every month. She learned to save money each month and quit buying things she didn't need. I didn't decide to pop the question to her until I saw this improvement in her. Even though I had a steady job at the time, I wanted to launch my own company before we had children. So following our engagement, I quit my job to focus on starting my business. I sincerely appreciate my wife supporting me during those difficult initial months when I was putting in endless hours to launch my company. I needed her unwavering support more than ever during those unbelievably frustrating days, even though I had saved enough money to never need her financially. It takes a lot of commitment and effort to start a business. As a perfectionist, I found it especially difficult to learn how to effectively manage and assign tasks to my team in order to expand my business. I waited to marry Christy until after I had successfully established the basis of my company because I wanted to make sure I could support her. In the last 28 years, my company has experienced substantial growth and expansion. My business helps me earn a good living. My dream of being able to give my parents a comfortable life has come true. Chrissy was also successful in quitting her work to raise her children at home. We didn't really have any big problems in our relationship as far as I can tell. That is, I believed. Up until this point, Christy mostly hung out with her friends or went to the gym after the kids grew up. We still have a very close relationship even though we go out on dates every Friday. Our kids quickly grew accustomed to us being affectionate with each other because they watched us do it all their lives. We never had any significant arguments in our family, but we had an incident one night that completely turned our lives around. You see, during this time Robert was a teenager, and like any other teenager, he had his typical mood swings. He stopped hanging out with me like he usually did. Instead, he spent a lot of time with his friends or in his room listening to music. I felt sad that my little boy was growing, but I didn't mind, and always reminded him that I was there for him whenever he needed me. On the other hand, my daughter, being 8 years younger than him, was still a child and still needed me. Unlike my teenage son, Diana would rush to greet me as soon as I came home from work. I cherished the way her eyes would light up whenever she would spot me holding a teddy bear or flowers behind my back to surprise her. I guess you could say that Robert might have been a bit jealous that I spent most of my time and attention after work on Diana. It was never my intention because I always tried to include him as much as possible. However, I think another issue was his relationship with his mother. She didn't hesitate to show favoritism towards our daughter. She loved how similar Diana was to her and would often point it out. Sometimes I would privately urge her to spend more time with Robert as well, but she would always dismiss my concerns, telling me that he probably just needed his space and I was overthinking things. I don't know what issues she had with our son, but she never gave him any time of day. If they ever did talk, it was always just small talk. Hence, it did not come as a surprise to me. when Robert started to rebel. Slowly it began with him talking back to his mother. But it escalated when he started sneaking out at night to drink with his friends. One night he even took my car keys without permission and was caught by the police while driving under the influence. I was shocked to receive a call from the police in the middle of the night, informing me about my son's situation. Fortunately, they decided to give him a warning since it was his first offense. I was furious. I gave Robert a stern lecture about how he was jeopardizing his future. I expected my wife to support me, but instead she defended Robert, saying that young people needed to have fun sometimes and that what he was doing wasn't much different from what she had done herself. I was shocked, because this was not something I wanted our son to hear. That night marked the first major fight in our family because it felt like she was reverting to her irresponsible self from her college years. I felt I had to step up as a parent because she seemed like how our son was acting. In response, thinking it reminded her of her own past. Robert, on the other hand, did not care and told me that he just wanted to be alone. I tried to encourage him to go for therapy, but he refused, telling me that he didn't need anybody's help. He continued to be defiant, would talk back to us at home. We would frequently receive complaints from the school about his incomplete assignments and disciplinary issues. It was like he was becoming a completely different person altogether. Whenever I wanted to sit down and talk to him, he would dismiss me or keep quiet the whole time just to avoid any conversation. His behavior started to worry me a lot. And during this challenging period, I also had to travel extensively for work because I was in the process of expanding my business. Looking back, I realize I might have neglected my responsibilities as a father. Perhaps I should have made more effort to talk to my son, even though he was pushing me away. I wish I could have held on to my son and taken away whatever it was that was troubling him. One day, it all came to a head when I returned home from one of my work trips to hear my wife and son screaming at each other. As I entered the kitchen, I found broken glasses and plates strewn across the floor. My son was facing my wife, yelling about how much he hated her. Instinctively, I positioned myself between them to protect my wife because I did not like the way my son was screaming at her. My son then, upon seeing me, redirected his anger towards me, accusing me of being a coward and yelling at me for being a deadbeat father, which deeply shook me. I attempted to calm him down and asked my wife what had transpired. But he continued shouting, insisting that our marriage was a sham and accusing us of lying to him his entire life. Confusion clouded my thoughts as I struggled to comprehend what he was insinuating. My wife sternly intervened, reprimanding him for discussing our marriage and reminding him that he was too young to make such accusations. My son argued back that he was disgusted with us and did not want to live with us anymore. I was at a loss to understand what could have triggered such a reaction, but he refused to explain himself. Frustrated by his behavior, I demanded that he apologize to his mother for the hurtful names he called her. But he scoffed at me and adamantly refused. He insisted he meant every word and expressed how sick he was of pretending that we were a perfect family. I tried to reason with him, reminding him that no family is flawless and that name-calling wouldn't solve anything. However, he lashed out and started to blame me for everything and even claimed that I didn't deserve to have children. His words cut deep, and I was taken aback by what he had spoken. In a fit of anger, I did the unthinkable. I slapped my son. I deeply regretted my actions. The moment my hand connected with his cheek, the room fell silent as shock registered on everyone's faces. My son staggered back, clutching his cheek in disbelief while my wife gasped audibly, her eyes wide with horror. I had never laid a hand on my children before, and the realization of what I had done hit me like a ton of bricks. Guilt and shame flooded over me as I stepped back, unable to comprehend my own behavior. My son's stunned expression turned into a mix of anger and hurt, and I could see tears welling up in his eyes. Without a word, he ran upstairs, leaving my wife and me standing in stunned silence. She approached me and offered a half-hearted hug, murmuring that it would be okay and suggesting I apologize to him later. I stood there, my hand trembling, realizing the damage I had caused to our family. About an hour later, as I helped my wife clean up the kitchen, the doorbell rang, and before I could reach the door, my son hurried downstairs to answer it. It was his grandparents, my wife's parents, whom he had called to come and take him with them. They were already aware of the incident, and while they understood the situation, they reprimanded me for my actions. I attempted to apologize to my son in an effort to mend things, but he ignored me as if I didn't exist. He had packed his bags and went away to live with his grandpa parents. He didn't even stay to say goodbye to Diana, who was at a friend's place celebrating her birthday at that time. Initially, we hoped this move would be temporary, but Robert eventually made it clear we had no intention of returning home after that incident. I did everything humanly possible to seek his forgiveness. I apologized daily attempted conversations when visiting his grandparents' place, where he often locked himself in his room and sent countless texts pleading for communication. Despite my efforts, my son ceased all contact with me. The only ongoing expectation was to financially support his education while he lived with his grandparents. I also talked to my wife regarding the incident, and she explained that Robert and she had an argument about his homework that escalated quickly. At that moment, I had no reason to doubt her account, especially considering Robert's previous behavioral patterns. For a long time, I believed that my son's apparent hatred and abandonment was solely because of that one incident. When my son got into college with a full scholarship, I couldn't have been prouder of him. I sent him a text congratulating him and expressing how proud I was. I ended the message with another apology. However, he responded with a long text asking me to stop sending him these messages and stating that I was no longer his father. His words echoed the painful memory of that night when he called me a deadbeat father. Despite all my efforts to reconcile with him, I had apologized countless times for that one slap. And if my son continued to hold such resentment towards me, I felt there was nothing more I could do to repair our relationship. That conversation marked the last time we spoke these past 5 years. I deeply miss my son a lot, and I think about him all the time. Despite no communication with me, he has maintained a steadfast relationship with our daughter. Diana sometimes updates me and my wife about our son, but mostly we avoid discussing his name because it's too painful. Diana knows about that fateful night and the incident where I slapped her brother. Although she was disappointed in me, she does understand the depth of my remorse for that action. Yesterday, on her birthday, Diana expressed her wish to spend the entire day with our son at the adventure park. I was genuinely happy for her and hoped that they would have a wonderful time together. When Diana returned home late that night, she appeared disturbed while Chrissy had already fallen asleep. I stayed awake to ensure our daughter returned safely. I also hoped to catch sight of our son in case he accompanied her back. When I asked her about her day, Diana shook her head. Concerned, I inquired if something had happened to her. It was then that my daughter asked me if I knew the real reason why Robert had left that night, confused. I asked her about what she meant, but she told me that Robert misses me, even though he will never admit it. And he had shared something troubling with her that she found hard to believe. I pressed her for details, but Diana suggested that I should probably go through the emails my son had apparently sent me years ago. Initially, I believed my daughter might have misunderstood Robert because if he had ever sent me emails, I would have undoubtedly responded to them. Checking my email, I found no emails from Robert. Puzzled, I wondered why he would tell Diana he had emailed me if he hadn't. I recalled having an old email address that I hadn't used in years, which I had used to create my Facebook account. Although I hadn't used it in a long time, I thought it might be worth logging in to check for any emails from my son, even though I have forgotten my password. I managed to recover my account successfully. Imagine my shock when I found several emails from my son sent over the years, just waiting to be opened in my inbox. I began reading through the emails he had sent, and I soon realized that my son would send me an email every time he was having a difficult day. It brought tears to my eyes as I went through his messages. In his recent emails, he expressed his regret more and more about not opening up to me sooner about the real reason why he left that night. In it, my son recounted the night he had argued with my wife. He described returning home from school to find her in bed with someone else. Naturally, he was furious and proceeded to yell at her. In retaliation, she blackmailed him, insisting he keep the information to himself, warning him that revealing it could lead to our divorce. She also informed him that I have reportedly been cheating on her throughout my work trips and that we had an open marriage. This discovery deeply horrified our kid, forcing him to call me all those names, believing his mother's charges were genuine. It wasn't until years later, when he started going for therapy, that he recognized precisely how his mother had plainly misled him by staying connected with Diana. He gradually recognized that our marriage was never open, and that his mother had been the one cheating behind my back. He closed the email by saying how he didn't have the confidence to face me, knowing that he was the one who had walked out of the family and had mistreated me for years. As I read his email, I felt a surge of shock and despair. It was like a punch to the belly, reading the reality my son had been holding on to all these years. I felt betrayed and outraged, discovering that my wife had been cheating on me all these years and I had absolutely no idea. My life feels like it has come apart. How should I proceed? Should I confront my wife about this even if I don't have any proof? What if she denies it? Especially considering she rarely acknowledges to any faults. First update. Hi to all of you. It's been a week since I last updated to fast update you. My wife initially denied knowing anything, but I persisted in asking questions until she eventually sobbed and admitted everything. She recalled the identical things that Robert had provided with me in the email and acknowledged having an affair years ago when she was a teenager. She acknowledged that she feared losing me. Therefore, she had concocted the falsehood that our marriage was open in order to silence Robert. She continued by telling me how she persuaded our son to keep the information a secret. But that night's conflict resulted from his rage at both of us. I honestly didn't care at that moment, but she never told me who the man was. My son's emails revealed to me that my wife had an affair, something I had never known about until I discovered it. I could not believe how vile she was to have lied to our kid and ruined our relationship for years. She also said during our fight that she had always preferred daughters, which was why she had never loved our son. She went on to say that maybe this was another reason she was never able to connect with him. I was unable to look at her face after that without getting crimson in the face. I told my wife that our marriage was finished and requested her to leave right away, and I did it without hesitation. Diana seemed to know about the affair despite her pleadings for reconsideration, and her suspicions were reinforced when she saw us fight. Understandably, she was upset with her mother and would not speak to her. This week, I also tried to get in touch with Robert to ask for more clarification on this. His answers were reserved at first, but when I finally broke down and told him how much I missed him, he started to get emotional as well. He expressed remorse for leaving the house that evening and expressed a wish he could go back in time to apologize to me. I have the deepest sympathy for my son. My wife's manipulation of the whole incident to conceal it still astounds me. My children desire no contact with their mother and support my choice to divorce her. When all these years, I finally understand why my wife never missed our kid as much as I did, and why she never made an effort to get in touch with him when he moved out. She would always accuse me of slapping him and make me feel bad for years if I brought up that night. What I know now, I wish I had known then.